Cool. Okay, everyone. Well, hello and welcome to the Legal Food Hub's winter webinar series. My name is Scott Sanderson, and I'll be moderating this presentation. I work for the Legal Food Hub, a project of Conservation Law Foundation, and we work to connect farmers, food entrepreneurs, and nonprofits in the food space with pro bono attorney support. If you're in any of those careers, you're welcome to visit our website at www.legalfoodhub.org and apply for our services. We'll determine if you're financially eligible, discuss your legal goals, and then match you with an attorney who can assist you for free. We also provide educational materials. We have a resource library on our website with brief legal guides and webinars that cover various topics. And much like this webinar series, those resources are designed to provide you with foundational legal knowledge before you meet with an attorney. In today's webinar, we're going to cover what you need to know about a farm property before you commit to that property. And we're very fortunate to be joined by attorneys Laura Hartz and Stacey Kalk with Drummond Woodsum. Laura represents businesses, individuals, land trusts, and nonprofits on issues ranging from land use and real estate to nonprofit organization and project development. She's a special interest in representing farms and has a master's degree from Tufts University's Agriculture, Food, and Environment program. Stacey specializes in environmental law, natural resources law, and land conservation. She represents clients in a wide range of complex environmental and land use matters, including transactions, permitting, compliance, and litigation. Stacey also routinely represents land trusts and private landowners in establishing and complying with conservation easements over working landscapes, including farmland. So Laura and Stacey are going to present, and then they'll answer any questions at the end of the presentation. Feel free to submit questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and we'll be sure to address them at the end. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura and Stacey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. And hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us. Scott just gave you a wonderful introduction to us, so thank you. I will spare you from our own introductions. We'll move right into the subject matter here because we're really here for you. We want to know, we want to answer the questions that you have, and we want to know what some of those questions are. We're assuming that you're entering into this presentation thinking, hey, I've found my farm property. It's going to be pretty easy, right? I mean, I've identified what I want. I've found what I want. I can just sign, right? Maybe that means you've spent a lot of time at a coffee shop looking at different properties online. Maybe you've looked at some wonderful other resources, perhaps by the New England Farmland Finder, New England Farmland Link Collaborative. Maybe you found that golden property on Craigslist. But before you sign, we want you to stop and just do the standard due diligence that any buyer or tenant would do before they sign on that dotted line and commit themselves for potentially a really long time. Today, Stacey and I are going to talk about basically just 5 topics, and then we'll provide you with some more resources at the end of the presentation. We'll talk about the intended use of the property, site conditions, regulatory requirements and restrictions, the human element, people are always the most important and sometimes the most difficult, paperwork, and then again, we'll talk to you about where else to begin or to continue your information gathering. So first and foremost, your intended use. You found this beautiful farm property, and now before you sign, we want you to think about what you're going to do with that property for the next 10 years, 40 years, 50 years, what you want your kids to do with that property if you're in a traditional land acquisition mindset, or if you're thinking about being a tenant, what you want to do for the whole term of the lease and any renewal periods. Farms are always sort of interesting because there's like the food and farm production side of things, which, we leave to you. You are the experts in that, that's your wheelhouse. That side of the house is for you. The things that can get complicated are when there's farm adjacent businesses, or you invite the public to your property, or you start to think about how structures are going to be built on your property over time. There's a lot of different sort of permutations of what a farm and farm business looks like. some of the things that people are more familiar with perhaps are the farm stand at the end of the driveway where people come up and serve themselves, or maybe you want to invite the public onto your property for a specific amount of time, every calendar year. It's the month of August because you pick blueberries. It's a pick your own operation. In the context of inviting the public onto your property, you're going to have to think about the kinds of structures that will be necessary either to make the space comfortable for them or potentially, legally compliant. You got to think about what kind of parking area you're going to have. What kind of public access? Is the driveway suitable? Is the road that leads to the driveway suitable? Is it a public road? Hopefully, yes, it is. It's also important to think about signage. You see just very basic signage here, but any signage that's potentially, on the public property or public facing, you might need a permit for that. You might need that permit from your local jurisdiction, your town, your city, whatever it is. As I said,
Laura, I'm so sorry to interrupt just for a second. I just wanted to let you know, technical issue, we are only seeing the disclaimer slide. We are not seeing any of the other slides on our end. So I just wanted to, it sounds like that's what participants are seeing as well.
Oh, here, let's share the screen again and see if that fixes the problem. Okay, can you see the presentation now?
Yes, we can.
Hey, you missed so many great pictures, everyone. So sorry about that. Yeah, so this is you shopping for your farm property. These are all the places you've looked, right? Let's see. This is our agenda. That's your fabulous farm property that you picked out. Here we are. Can you see that, Stacy?
Sure can.
Awesome. Thanks so much for interrupting. So let's see, we talked about how your property might be used for all sorts of different types of farm business operations and activities. Another thing to be thinking about that happens on farms a lot is what kind of food processing you want to do on your farm. Maybe that's just vegetable washing, or maybe it's something more complicated like canning salsa or poultry processing. And of course, you want to be thinking about parking, not necessarily just for the public, but for any employees that you might have, if that is the kind of scale that you're looking to go. Another thing that's unique about farm properties is that lots of times there's residences either on the farm properties or adjacent to the farm property. So maybe that's a home for you, maybe it's for you and your family, maybe you also want to provide housing for workers or interns, sometimes seasonal workers. Housing's required depending on what kind of sort of legal arrangement you have with that seasonal worker. Another thing we like to think about is energy generation. Maybe you don't have the funds to put up a solar panel at this time, but 10 years down the road, will you be interested in putting up a solar array that can provide electricity to your farm business for your farm operation? Maybe sell whatever electricity that's in excess back to the grid. Maybe do something as large scale as what's shown on the screen. Maybe not. But just things to be thinking about when you're shopping around and really evaluating your farm property before you sign on the dotted line. So with that, Stacy's going to talk to you about site conditions.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So I want to talk about site conditions, and that's the physical conditions at the site. And we're going to start talking about sort of the environmental conditions. And when I use that term, often what I'm really talking about is contamination. Is there contamination at the site? Hopefully there's not. And likely at many of these farmlands, it's not an issue, but it is a real issue at properties around the northern New England area, and something that you should consider. So to begin with, I wanted to talk very briefly about a tool that is available to you called Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment. This is where you would hire an environmental consultant to go and do an assessment of your property. There's not any testing that would happen. They're not going out and testing the soil and seeing what levels of contamination might exist. Really what they're doing is they're understanding the historic use of the property. They're understanding the current use of the property. They're looking at records associated associated with the property at the town, state, and federal level, kind of getting a picture as to what the property's uses have been, and given those uses and given what they visibly see on the property, what potential might there be for environmental contamination. This is something that I routinely recommend to all commercial buyers of property, and it's definitely something that farmers can consider doing as well. And it serves two purposes, both an informational purpose and a liability protection purpose. So as we talked about, so the informational purpose is giving you that information, given this environmental consultant going out who has a lot of experience with similar properties. What are they seeing that you may not see? What are they understanding given the records that they're reviewing? And some of those records are records that are available to the town, but some of those records are things that might be available only at the federal level. And so they're pulling from all of those resources to give you a picture of the land. And then what they'll come up with are potential recommendations about next steps. They'll identify whether there's any recognized environmental conditions. And then you would have the option, based on that information, to decide whether or not you want to do any testing at that site. And you would do all of this before you purchase a property. The other part of it that's important is liability protection. And so part of the reason that many commercial entities do this, besides the information gathering purpose, is because it provides a defense for liability under the federal Superfund law for buyers. And so Superfund law, also called CERCLA, is a mechanism to hold what's called potentially responsible parties liable for hazardous substance contamination at a site. What you need to be aware of is as soon as you purchase a property, as soon as you start operating at the property, perhaps you're leasing the property, you automatically are considered a potentially responsible party, even if you have no connection with the contamination that exists at that property. Now, to put it into perspective, there's not, hundreds and thousands of properties that are deemed Superfund sites in Maine. Since I'm a Maine-based lawyer, I'm going to talk a bit about Maine specific. For example, in Maine, there's only 12 Superfund sites. That being said, that is a consideration depending on what the site history, not only of that particular site, but also, like Laura mentioned, understanding the surrounding sites. So even if your site might not have had any, contamination issues associated with releases of hazardous substances at your site, that phase 1 environmental site assessment is also going to assess whether there's any concerns from neighboring properties, either those that are immediately adjacent or in the vicinity that might be connected, because it's down gradient. So that gives you a picture, like a really 3D picture of your property. If you do decide to do a phase 1 environmental site assessment, there are some timing considerations that you should be aware of. One, it's going to take a couple months. You call up the environmental consultant and they're not necessarily going to be able to get out that week or the next week. They're pretty backed up. But that being said, usually you can get in the next couple weeks to a month, you can get somebody to go out and get a report back several weeks after that. So you just do need to consider that. The other thing to consider is that if you're using the report for liability protection, and I would definitely urge you, if you go that route, to do that, you'll need to make sure that the report is done 180 days before the conveyance happens. So you can't do it afterwards for liability protection. You've already bought the property. You can do it anytime you want for information gathering, but it's definitely going to be most useful before you make the decision. And if it's more than 180 days, you'll have to do an update in order to get that liability protection. I will just also caution you that the trigger of when that 180-day period begins is going to change soon. So if you do decide to go this route, make sure you speak with your environmental consultant at that time to understand what that trigger is. And that will lead me also to the next thing I want to talk about, which is PFAS. And the reason I'm going to talk about it quickly in terms of phase 1 is that right now, PFAS, which are commonly known and commonly referred to as the forever chemicals, they are not considered hazardous substances right now under federal law. That is likely to change later this year, when at least 2 of those substances probably will be. So if you want for them to be reviewed in the phase 1, you're going to need to ask the environmental consultant to do a PFAS add-on. And if you decide to go and do a phase 1, I strongly urge, if you're buying farmland or leasing farmland, that you do add this PFAS phase 1. That's a particular issue for farmers right now. Now, I'm going to I know that probably many people on here are quite familiar with PFAS, but I'm sure that there's some that are less familiar. And so I want to kind of briefly go into what they are and why they're something that farmers should be concerned about, or at least considering when they're looking at property and deciding whether or not this particular property is suitable for their farming needs. So PFAS are, like I said, they're forever chemicals. They're really difficult to break down in the environment. They've been used in many different industries, things like stain and water resistant fabrics, firefighting foam, cookware, cleaning products, pulp and paper manufacturing, things that have happened and continue to happen in northern New England. Where is PFAS contamination most prevalent? Well, one of the sources of PFAS contamination is our wastewater streams. And as many people are familiar with, over the last several decades, the sludge from wastewater treatment plants has been spread at many farms across this country, in fact, not just this area. And unbeknownst to people involved at the time, much of that sludge was contaminated, sometimes with low levels and sometimes with quite high levels of PFAS, which is now on these farms. And so here in Maine, PFAS sludging is not occurring anymore, but the effects are still being felt across the state. So it can be carried, spread on the sludge is spread on the fields. It can be carried into the groundwater and affect drinking water, which is sort of the focus right now for many people, for many regulatory agencies, is looking at making sure that the groundwater is suitable for drinking and irrigation. So if you're in Maine, and I think New Hampshire has something similar, DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, has created a map that shows sites where they're currently investigating the potential for PFAS contaminated sludge. So I think if you're located in a state that has something like this, you want to check out that map. I've put some links at the end of our presentation that will give you access to those maps, both in Maine and then a database in New Hampshire. I would also caution you two things. One, just because a property that you're considering is not on the map does not mean that there wasn't sludge spreading. What it means is the sites that are on this map are ones that were licensed for sludge spreading. So similarly, just because it's on the map doesn't mean sludge spreading occurred. Just because it was licensed doesn't mean the sludge spreading happened. And also, even if the sludge spreading happened, it's possible that the sludge that was spread didn't have high levels of PFAS and it's not an issue. So really, this is a data point to give you, and then if you look through some of the information on this map, it can also, for some of the properties, it will tell you, have they done testing, what potentially the results of that testing have been. So it may give you more information, or it may just say this was a sludge spreading site, in which case then you want to ask more questions. You also want to consider maybe your property did not have sludge spreading, but a neighboring property did. And of course, sludge spreading on a neighboring property could impact your property. You want to look into that. And also, I've heard from many folks that, sludge was spread on lots of other sites that were not permitted. Somebody had a dump truck full, only dumped off half of it at a sludge spreading site, had another half, didn't want to just return. A neighbor said, hey, can you just dump, put it over here? I would love some of that for my property. And it was spread. So again, use that information, but it's not going to tell you definitively whether or not there's an issue, but it's going to give you some information so that you know potentially what the risks are and what to ask in terms of more questions. Another thing that you're going to want to take a quick look at is whether or not there's any, and this is whether or not there's any underground storage tanks at the property. And that's something you want to understand, whether there's any currently or there's any in the past. This is actually in many states pretty easy to look up. Most states do have this information available online. Again, we're going to put some links to that at the end of the presentation for Maine and New Hampshire, where you can find out whether or not there's any registered underground storage tanks. If there are any underground storage tank at your property, what I would suggest you do is just call up the regulatory agency in Maine. That's the Department of Environmental Protection. And then there's different organizations within whatever state regulatory agency it is that would focus on this. You call the right individual, you ask them, hey, is there a tank here? If so, are they compliant? Have they been providing you with the monitoring reports? Are there any issues that you're aware of? My experience is they get back to you pretty quickly with that information, but you can also find a lot of that information out online as well. You're also going to want to consider if there was formerly an underground storage tank, just make sure that it was closed properly. And what that means is when it was removed from the site, did they do all of the things that they needed to do to ensure that there wasn't contamination associated with that? Again, that's information you can often find online, but you can also give a call to understand that. And like Laura mentioned, and with the phase one, if you don't do a phase one, you're still going to want to understand the past use of the property so that you can understand better what the potential risks might be. So make sure that you ask those questions of the landowner or of the town so that you have a better understanding of how that property was used in the past and how it could impact how you'd like to use it going forward. I'm going to be much briefer on this second part because this is probably a lot of the things that you're more familiar with, which are evaluating the natural resources that are available on the property and how they can, how they will be able to assist you in your farming endeavors. So one, do you have access to potable water? Is it well water? Is it municipal water? Is it if you're going to not have access to municipal water and there is no drilled well, is the site suitable for drilling a well? Are there any deed restrictions that prevent you from using the water for drinking or irrigation purposes? Making sure that that's not there. That's something that's commonly done on properties that have had some contamination in the past. So you want to look at that. What's the quality of the water? If there's a PFAS concern, checking and making sure that there's no levels of PFAS that would prohibit you from using that water for drinking purposes or irrigation. Looking to see what the water systems are on that property. Are there irrigation systems? Is there surface water that can be used for irrigation? And is the soil suitable for farming? Again, this is probably one of the more, the first steps that you're thinking of anyway. You know, whether that's doing soil tests or looking at soil maps. You're also going to want to think about not just farming, but what else are you using the property for? And is the soil suitable for that purpose? Is the soil suitable in the area that you want to build buildings? Is it suitable to build septic? I'll give an example of something that we came across recently. A property, a farm property where someone wanted to build a building in an area that is buildable under both zoning and soil restrictions in that area. But unfortunately, under the zoning, they're not able to build a septic system. They actually had somebody come out and look at the property, and it is suitable for septic generally, but the zoning restrictions are much tighter when it comes to septic. And so unfortunately, under the zoning restrictions, they were unable to, which is why you need to read the fine print. So figure out what you want to do, and then take a look at what all the potential restrictions are. Make sure that you can build the type of structure you want with the associated utilities that you need to be able to do that. So I would always recommend that, you know, figuring, and Laura's going to talk about this in more depth in a minute, how those zoning may impact some of the uses that you intend on your property. I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Thanks, Stacey. That was a great background about environmental conditions, and thanks for the segue into zoning. So, and I did see a question in the chat about zoning too, and I'll answer that right now before I forget about it. So the question was along the lines of, how do we find out more about zoning if the code enforcement officer or the zoning administrator only has, you know, limited hours, or the town office is really open from 12 to 4 on Tuesdays, or even every third Tuesday of the month, something like that, depending on how small your towns are. The bigger the town or the bigger the city, the more likely it is that their ordinance is posted online. Ordinance, so that's the name of the code, the applicable code. Zoning code is another word for it, another name. Also, the applicable site plan regulations should be online, and even really small towns, I'll go over an example in a second, even really small towns have those online. So I hate to say it, but the power of Google is really supreme in this instance. So backing up, Zoning, what is zoning? Zoning is the exercise of the locality's police power, essentially, to determine what uses are suitable for what types of property. So the image over on the right-hand side of the screen here shows different types of zones in a city. This is just like a really big picture example of how different uses might be permitted. Go to the next slide here. Zoning itself can be broken down. I like to think about it in sort of 4 different ways. So one, a zone really determines what you can do on the property. That's the base district. Examples of base districts in zones are residential, agricultural, or commercial, or industrial. The bigger the town, the bigger the city, the more specific the base district, right? So maybe there's a base district for single family housing, or maybe there's a base district for commercial businesses with more than 2,500 square feet of inventory display. That's an example of very specific base district requirements. Whenever you have a base district, it's also possible to have an overlay district or an overlay zone. So something that we see pretty commonly here in Maine is the shoreland district overlay. In other states, at least in some municipalities or localities in New Hampshire, I've seen a historic zone overlay, historic district overlay. And basically what those overlay districts do is apply an additional level of restrictions about the types of activities or permitted uses. And that brings me to the other sort of way that I think about zoning. So, the zoning ordinance itself is about what types of uses you can do. It also sets out some of the sort of base level dimensional restrictions that those uses need under the locality's ordinance. And I'll show you an example in a second. But big picture, zoning is about what you can do on the property. In a second, we're going to talk about planning, which is how you can do something on the property. Those are governed by site plan regulations, sometimes subdivision regulations too, depending on your state. But the example that I want to talk to you about for zoning, so this is a small town in New Hampshire, Rindge. This is their website. I went to their zoning ordinance and I clicked on that link, and it might be worth a call to the code enforcement officer or zoning administrator and say, hey, is the ordinance that's posted on the website the most recent? Most likely it is, but it's always a good idea to check. You can see over here on the menu bar that there's also links to site plan regulations that I just mentioned, driveway regulations that might also apply, or the master plan. I mean, the master plan is how the town sets out their vision for what they want the town to be like now and in the future. So sometimes that's useful to take a look at. Tax maps can also be really useful because it's the way that the town sees the property, the dimensions of the property. And if you don't have a survey, if there's no recorded plan, some kind of visualization of the property is really helpful, I find. So a tax map might be the best way to get that information. Let's see. So I went to the Rindge zoning ordinance and I pulled up the base districts, which was Article 5. And I took a snapshot of the residential agricultural district just because, we're here at CLF, Legal Food Hub. And this is just a very short description of the types of uses that are allowed in the residential agricultural district. So the uses permitted here are uses permitted as of right. So, you have property in the zone, these types of uses are permitted. This first paragraph is just a general description of the type of use. So shall be a district of farms and single or two family dwellings only. And then there's further restrictions, a little bit lower. There's at least one resident employee of the building, no more than 5 non-resident employees. And, it gets more specific from there. To give you an example, though, of the kind of dimensional standards that I was talking about, so that's another aspect of zoning. This is from the same zone, so the same residential agricultural zone in Rindge, New Hampshire, small town. Every lot has to have a minimum frontage, so that's from one side of the property boundary to the other along the road. of at least 250 feet. And no building shall be located closer than 30 feet to an abutter's property line. So that means the neighbor and your property are adjacent. Your buildings have to be at least 30 feet away from that boundary line. So this is just an example of the kind of dimensional requirements that could apply. Again, bigger cities, bigger towns generally have more specific restrictions. They could be related to building height or, you know, I mean, really the limit is the imagination of the planning board and planning staff. A question that we get a lot is, well, what if you want to do something different than what's allowed in your zoning ordinance? And that's when you need either a variance or perhaps a special exception in New Hampshire. Sometimes there's also sort of flexibility built into the site plan regulations so that you can, you know, there can be perhaps one kind of structure and not another kind of structure as long as it's no higher than 50 feet, for example. But really a good idea is to try to figure out how you can call either the planner, the town planner, or sometimes they're called community development planners or coordinators or, you know, staff people. Zoning administrator is a good person to talk to. That's like the name of the person in New Hampshire. In Maine, a code enforcement officer. Those are the people that are charged with enforcing the rules that are set out in the ordinance. And then there's public boards. There's the zoning board and the planning board. Those are, you know, composed of people from the municipality that make decisions about applications before them. So this is just a very, very broad brush overview of the kind of things that zoning and planning sort of make you, or hopefully make you think about. This is a shout out to my sister and brother-in-law's farm in Vermont. So Milkweed Farm, they just do incredible work. It's a member CSA. But so one of the questions, I don't think this came up on their farm, but it's a question that I think comes up on farms a lot. See the high tunnel over on the right-hand side, does that meet the definition of a structure under the zoning ordinance? You know, you want to think about that. You want to maybe investigate whether that structure would need a special building permit. You know, most likely it doesn't, but it really depends on what the locality's rules say. When we go to planning boards, so that's when you've determined after consultation with either the planner or the community development assistant that you do need to go for site plan approval. And that, you know, the zoning ordinance or the planning site plan regulations set out what size project triggers site plan review. And there's also some statutory overlay there. It can be a somewhat extensive process and go through major site plan review, or it can be a relatively minor process going through minor site plan review. But when we say site plans, this picture is just to help you think about, you know, get a visual on what a site plan looks like from like a farm business perspective. So, you know, there's like the entry point to the parking lot. These are parking spaces. These are trees, for example. Very, very basic site plan orientation here, but just to give you a sense of the sort of visuals that come up. And so with that, we'll turn to, let's see, I think Stacy, this is you, site permitting, existing and new, is that right?
Yes, it sure is.
Oh, let's go back to this picture. It's more relevant. Is that good?
Sure, absolutely. So site permitting, we're really going to talk about this pretty briefly when it comes to the actual site permitting. Laura's going to speak a little bit more about activities permitting. It's something to be aware of. It's also very possible that there is no permitting that is applicable to your site, but you'll want to make sure if there is any permitting that exists for the site that you have a copy of it. So you want, first of all, ask the landowner, do they have any permitting? They may say, I have no idea, or no. Just because they said no doesn't mean that some doesn't exist. I will say time and time again with projects, both small and large, current owners are often unaware of some of the permitting that exists at the site. So first, ask the question, but second, go to the organizations that would be doing the permitting. So the two places I would recommend that you contact are, one, contact the town office, find out if there's any permitting that's associated with the site at the town level. And when we're talking about environmental permitting, contact the Environmental Protection Agency that is applicable in your state. Most of the permitting, if there is any, would probably be through the Land Bureau. So just, you can go on, find out the contacts, find a phone number for the Land Bureau. Often I can get an answer the same day. Can call, give the address and say, is there any permitting available? And they will send it to you. There's probably not, but if there is any permitting, you want to have copies of it because you want to understand what the conditions are that you need to comply with. You also want to know whether or not you have to transfer any of that once you purchase the property. Some permitting runs with the land. You don't have to do anything. You just comply with it. Some of it, there's affirmative obligations that you have to transfer it into your name. Again, that's information that you would find out once you obtain a copy of the permit. Thinking forward, so whether or not there's permitting that it currently exists for the site, you want to think about what your activities might be at the site and whether or not you'll need any permitting for those activities. Just going to speak about one type of permitting right now because it's probably the kind of permitting that you're most likely to encounter, and that's if there's any wetlands on your property, then it's possible that you might need permitting. If you're doing agricultural activities in and near wetlands, some of those are exempt. In many places, there's a lot of restrictions on what you can do by wetland or near and in wetlands, but there are a number of exemptions for certain types of agricultural activities. So you're going to want to understand, are there wetlands on the property? And if there are, what do you want to do in or near them? And if you want to do something, whether that's build a house, you want to do certain types of more, maybe you want to bring fill in so that you can do more farming in that area. All of those things may require permitting both at the federal and state level. And by federal level, you're talking about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Don't be intimidated. It's not that big of a deal. It's usually something along the lines of permit by rule type where you send in information and you get permission to do it. Again, it depends on what you want to do. Sometimes it can be pretty intensive depending on how many acres of wetlands there are on the property that you may be disturbing, and depending on the current regulatory status of that property. So don't be intimidated. It's a permitting process that you're going to have to undergo potentially depending on what you want to do. And there's a lot of rules about that, which we're not going to go into because it's different in every state. And then towns have their own differences about what you can do. But just, if you know that there's wetlands on the property, be mindful of what you want to do in those areas and consider, if you're going to build anything or you're going to do anything out of the ordinary, that you may need permitting for those activities. Things, if you're planning on having a more extensive operation at the site, you might also need stormwater permitting. But again, I think that in most cases, that's not going to be relevant to what you're doing. But I'm just putting it out there depending on the level of activity that you are going to be conducting at the site. I'm going to turn this over to Laura, who's going to talk more about permitting, but not related to the site, but related to the activities that are being conducted on the property.
Thank you, Stacy. Yeah, just a quick word that depending on the type of activity that you have, you might also be subject to an additional layer of regulatory review. So the example that I think about a lot is like a commercial kitchen, for example. You want to do some even limited or extensive processing of a food or farm product on your property. What kind of facilities do you need? And what kind of permits that then require those facilities? Really to ensure the health and safety of the product. Many of those changes and big picture requirements came down the pike with the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2010, but states really have taken the lead in developing their own food safety type requirements. So that's, a subject for a whole nother webinar here, but really just think about, oh, if I'm going to have some kind of interaction with the public, like if I'm producing a thing that I'm going to sell to the public or processing that in some manner, I might be subject to further requirements, essentially. So the next topic I think is probably the most interesting and potentially the thorniest, and that's the human element, right? So you all are farmers or maybe hoping to be farmers. You've all experienced working with people in some capacity, I'm sure. But when you're thinking about the farm property that you want to buy or the lease that you want to sign on the dotted line for, we like to think about what kind of rights the public or other people, basically third party, anyone other than you, the tenant, or the other party, the landlord. If you're buying or selling, it's buyer, seller, and then whoever the other people are, whoever the third parties are that have rights to the property. So from a legal perspective, third party rights in using the property can arise from a variety of different mechanisms. We commonly see easements. So easements are something that are recorded in the registry of deeds, and they're a creature of property law. We think about easements like one of the sticks in the bundle that are all of the property rights. I mean, if you're at all familiar with property law, there's this common sort of construct where the rights that someone owns in a piece of property is like a bundle of sticks, and all of the sticks is fee simple. That's like, I own my property. I haven't granted a mortgage to anybody. There's no liens in favor of anyone else. I haven't granted an easement for utilities. CMP doesn't come onto my property. I've given no permission for anyone else to access my property. But as soon as I give away an easement, that's like giving away one of those sticks, right? So when we think about easements, usually they're perpetual. Sometimes they're for a shorter period of time. It really depends on the language of the easement. There's a bunch of different ways to create easements. Most of them are written down in the registry of deeds, but sometimes like patterns of action, course of conduct can establish easements over time. That's another different subject. But something that I like to think about when I'm doing due diligence and when I'm helping a buyer understand what third-party rights the property is subject to, I look at the easement and I ask myself, does this benefit or burden the buyer or the tenant? So for example, an easement that benefits the property that my client wants to buy would be something, say on the neighbor's property, there's a spring, and with my deed comes the right to access that property to go get fresh water from the spring. That's an easement that benefits my client's property. There's also easements that burden property. So for example, my property is accessed by a dirt driveway, and then we have a neighbor further down the dirt driveway that also uses our driveway to access their house. That most likely is an easement for the benefit of that neighbor. So that burdens my property. It's a requirement that I have to let them, use the dirt driveway to get to their property. That's just a very broad overview of how easements work. There's this special kind of easement that Stacy and I deal with somewhat frequently in the context of farmers and land trusts, and that's a conservation easement, which I think Stacy's gonna take over for.
Yeah, so something that you'll want to look out for is whether or not there's a conservation easement on the property that you're considering. It's also something that you may consider entering into after purchasing a property. And what that is, it's essentially an agreement between the landowner and a conservation organization that property is going to be conserved in perpetuity for certain purposes. And one of those purposes often can be agricultural purposes. Not all conservation easements allow agricultural activities, but there is a whole sort of segment of the conservation easement world that is dedicated to working lands. When that could be farmland, it could be timberland. Those are the most common sort of in the northern New England area. Something that you should be aware of is it's governed by both state and federal tax law, because there are tax benefits to the landowner for entering into this if there's if part of this is a contribution or a donation. And it runs with the land. So you might be buying this property from a current landowner who entered into this agreement. The agreement does not end when that landowner sells their land. The agreement continues with the property in perpetuity. That's the reason that it can be conserved in perpetuity. And so as the landowner, as a new landowner, you'd be stepping into the shoes of the current landowner, or maybe you're leasing land, you're stepping into the shoes of the owner or the current individual who's leasing that property. And so you need to make sure if there is a conservation easement on the property, it would be in the registry of deeds. They would definitely need to let you know about it, but you'd want to make sure that that is something that you have access to, and you're going to want to read through the terms. Often, if it's an agricultural easement, they're thinking through already in advance a lot of the things that you may want to do on the property. And so if it is an agricultural easement, it's likely that you're going to be able to do most of the farming. But there might be other things you'd like to do on the property other than farming. For example, maybe you're interested in building a home or an additional home on the property. Maybe you're interested in having renewable energy generation on your property to support your farm. And then whether or not you can do those things depends on the terms of the conservation easement. So I encourage you, if there is one, to look at it. One thing that I'll mention too is that one of the things that conservation easements do is affect the cost of the land, because of the fact that you're essentially selling or giving away some of the development rights for that land. Land that's subject to a conservation easement is often less costly for a farmer to acquire. It's also something that if you do acquire farmland and there is no conservation easement, it's something you could consider in the future as a revenue tool. One thing that, again, since Laura was just talking about, well, how can you make changes if there's zoning restrictions? You should also think, well, you have a conservation easement. How do you make changes to that? If you're interested in this property, but there's some things in the conservation easement that would prohibit some of the activities you'd like to do. One of the, it's not just a contract between parties where you and the conservation organization can just make a decision to change the terms and sort of move forward from there. Some amendments are quite minor, and that is exactly what can happen. But it depends on the scale of the amendment and how it affects the conservation values that are protected. And so some amendments do require court approval. So you just need to understand, if it's prohibiting you right now, the conservation easement, from doing what you want, there's going to be costs involved with going through the process of trying to amend it. And also, you're not guaranteed that it would be amended. So just take that into consideration. However, if you're looking at a conservation easement that does allow farming, typically most of the uses that you're going to want to do related to farming would be something that's allowed under that. But there are other types of conservation easements, not just over working lands. So those are typically way more restrictive in terms of uses that you would want to do in farming. So again, take a look and see, is this a conservation easement that's intending to only limit this to, for wildlands? And so there is no sort of human use that's allowed on the property. Obviously, that would not be a suitable site for farming. And again, if there is a conservation easement, get to know the organization that holds that conservation easement. You're going to have a long-term relationship with that organization. Make sure it's an organization that you'll want to work with long-term. You're going to have annual visits. So again, just get to know them as a part of your due diligence process. And then lastly, in terms of conservation restrictions, there is also the possibility that there's conservation restrictions in things other than conservation easements, just in the deed itself. So that's another area where there might be some restrictions on the type of use of your property. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Laura.
Thanks, Stacey. That was really helpful. And great segue again into the next topic. I'll just touch on it really briefly, but that's what your relations with your neighbors are going to be like. So, before you buy a property, before you sign as the long-term tenant on a lease, you should probably get to know who's around the property and who the neighbors are and what kind of business operations they do if it is commercial property. Just because it's a reality of the site location. There's not a lot necessarily that you can do to disagree or contest with whatever the neighbor is doing on their property, assuming that it's in compliance with zoning law and site plan regulations and state and federal law. But even if it isn't, you know, you want to think about the long-term relationship between you and the neighbor and how you can sort of invest in a good relationship going forward. We generally see as real estate lawyers, when neighbors come to us and there's a dispute between them, lots of times it's about the rights that one neighbor has over the other person's property. So for example, you know, the view shed rights or the access rights that we talked about earlier pursuant to an easement. Other types of disagreements that we see between neighbors are as to boundaries. And that's a fairly standard document to draft as a boundary line agreement under Maine law, at least, where you can agree on where the boundary between the two properties is. And that's a finite way to resolve any dispute. We record that in the registry of deeds. Another thing to think about, though, is the types of uses that your neighbors have. So for example, maybe they have a Christmas tree farm. Let's see if I can get to the next slide. And every weekend or not every weekend, every weekend in December, there's 50 cars that line up. You know, is that a potential nuisance, or is that a pattern that you can sort of deal with so that when you need to have the mobile poultry processing unit on your farm in August, you know, they're not going to complain about for, you know, any kind of access related to that, for example. Sort of a weird example, but the concept is like invest in the long-term relationship so that you can use the property and that they can use their property. And our last topic that we're going to talk about is the paperwork. So we're lawyers. Sorry, it's just part of the process. Everything that gets written down is important. It's important to us. It's important to you because that's what binds you, you know, it's the contract. So make sure you read it. Things to think about paperwork wise when we're counseling farmers is what kind of corporate structure is important or relevant. And I know when I say corporation, some people are like, oh, hell no. But corporate structure is lawyer speak for like, should you be an LLC or a nonprofit, or maybe you even want to be like a low profit limited liability company. Some states have that form of corporate structure. The idea is to try to get some liability protection between you and your business, you know, put up a liability protection wall between you and your business and your family or your personal assets. It's just sort of a fact of life, especially it's an important one when you're thinking about farm businesses. You know, do you want the property to be in a separate LLC other than the operating entity? You know, ownership structures can get really complicated. We don't have to go into them here in depth, but there can be some benefit to setting up an entity rather than just owning property outright. Another topic that people often ask us about is how to pay for everything. So and I saw this in some of the questions and comments in the chat. So, you know, how do we pay for maybe some of the due diligence and environmental site assessments or inspections, or, you know, how do we get the resources that we need to make sure that we can make the decision about whether this is a good farm property for us? I'm guessing that there's some, I'm remembering from a conversation with Stacy previously, sorry to put you on the spot, Stacy, about some grant resources that might be available. But also there are a lot of resources that you can find for free, and we'll talk about those in the next slide. We'll provide you with some links. But there's a whole host of organizations out there that are trying to help farmers especially figure out if their property is the right one. So, you know, there's lots of resources out there to help pay for any kind of investigation, and really Google is a wonderful tool to have in your back pocket. In terms of financing, another topic that comes up somewhat frequently is if you're going to be a buyer, if you're going to grant a mortgage to the bank or to any financing institution. So a mortgage is like giving out one of those sticks from the property rights bundle. It says it acts as security. It says, I promise to pay the total amount of the loan that you give me. And if I don't pay it, if I don't make timely payments, or if I don't do any of the other things that are required in the mortgage, then the bank, after usually some notice and cure periods, then the bank gets to foreclose and take possession of the property, and usually they sell it and try to make the money back on their mortgage, right, on their loan. Mortgages can be really scary, but once you get sort of the nuts and bolts of how they work and how they just secure the loan value, they can be sort of less intimidating. All mortgages and other security interests should be recorded in the registry of deeds, and will be turned up in the chain of title. So, a whole other webinar topics that we could talk about at another time. Leasing is another common ownership arrangement. It's not ownership in the sense of fee simple or permanent rights to property, right? But it's rights that you get as a tenant. If you're a tenant, lots of times there's not a lot of negotiating power, but the most opportune time to negotiate is before you sign the lease, because that's when you have the most leverage, right? I mean, the landlord has an interest in making sure that they get paid monthly, that they get their rent monthly. So, they have an incentive to meet your expectation before you sign the lease. So if you can review the lease, negotiate any terms, really do that before you sign it. And then another just paperwork thought, insurance is going to be important. So most mortgages require some kind of insurance. Most leases require insurance. And, big picture, you should be thinking about if you're inviting the public onto your property in any way, it's really good idea to have liability insurance. Umbrella policies are relatively cheap. And that's just something that would be a good idea if you do start to have a bigger operation, or you are subject to a lease or a mortgage. So that's just a brief overview of all of the paperwork, maybe a small fraction of the paperwork. But some of the resources that we've talked about so far, I'll just highlight a couple here. So the second bullet from the bottom, the registry of deeds, at least in Maine and New Hampshire, and most likely other states, I just haven't looked into it specifically, there's a register of deeds for each county. And in Maine and New Hampshire, they're both available online. And it's really interesting. You can find like some incredible history about all property in a state, basically in all of the United States. The deeds are sorted by grantor and grantee instead of by location. So it's pretty rare that you can type in an address and find the deed that applies to that property. You have to know who the grantor or grantee is. And when I say grantor or grantee, that's like the person that's either giving away the property or the property right, or grantee is the person who's receiving the property or property right. So for example, when my partner and I bought our house, the registry of deeds, you look up my last name, Hartz, and you can see the deed that conveyed the property to us. You can also see the mortgage, like all of the records of the property rights are right there in the registry of deeds. And it's really helpful to just take a look if you have any of the names and see what you can find. Many times tax maps and tax records or tax cards for the locality will include a citation to the registry of deeds for that owner. So for example, it might say, Cumberland County Registry of Deeds, book 407, 472, and then page 3 is the book and page where the deed for my property is, just as a hypothetical. You then go to the Cumberland County Registry of Deeds website, you click on either search by grantor or grantee, or you can type in that book and page and that'll get you to the deed. So, if you don't know the grantor or grantee's name, try to find the tax maps, which will then, or tax card, which will then show you the book and page. Stacy, do you want to talk about the other records that might be available or resources that our participants can turn to?
Yes, absolutely. I'll also mention for the registry of deeds, that's where you can find things like if there's a conservation easement on the property, if there's any easements on the property. So it's a good tool to search, but like Laura says, you do need to know specific information. If you know who's selling the property, that will get you started. And you can also search the tax cards at the municipality, and that's typically online, not always, but usually online, so that you know if you're not sure who's selling the property, it'll give you that information, and then you can use that name in the registry of deeds. So yeah, I also here, if you look at the bullet above, underground storage tanks, I put links to websites that will give you some information in both Maine and New Hampshire. And there you can actually search by town. That's how unless it's a really large town, I typically search by town, because sometimes the full address isn't listed, or, you know, it's under one name, not the name you'd expect. And so what I do is I put in the name of the town, and then I just look down the list. Even for big towns, it's still sometimes worth doing that, because if you try to just put in the address, you might miss it. Sometimes it'll only say the name of the street or a cross section, and not everything. But you can search through there, and then you can get an understanding of whether or not there's any underground storage tanks that were there currently or in the past. I put the Department of Environmental Protection website for Maine and the Department of Environmental Services website for New Hampshire. That if you click on either of those, there's lots of lists of contact information and about the bureaus. We talked about before contacting the Land Bureau in both of those instances to find out about any site permitting. And then looking down at the bottom, we also put a link in Maine for that PFAS map that I had talked about earlier, as well as, again, this one-stop search for New Hampshire. They have more information available online than Maine does. And so this one-stop search, if you can put in some information about the property, it's going to pull up information that New Hampshire has on that particular site, whether it's PFAS issues, whether it's an underground storage tank, permitting, etc. And so these are just some of the resources that will get you started. I also did want to circle back quickly to the question about funding for environmental site assessments. I wanted to mention two different things. In Maine, there is funding from the state for PFAS testing. Now, that's typically available to a current landowner and current landowners that had licensed sludge spreading on their site. So if you're purchasing property that you see did have licensed sludge spreading on the site, it's likely or possible that that landowner has been contacted by the state, and there's been a request made to do some testing. So find out about that from them. And if they haven't, that testing at this point is being paid for by the state. So that's information that if you're asking it, typically any halfway sophisticated purchaser is going to be asking the same thing. They're going to want that information as well. And if you can share with the landowner that is testing that they can get paid for by the state, that would be beneficial for you to have the answers to. And also, depending on the site, this is often not relevant for farmers, but I actually just this past month was working on a project with a farmer doing this, which is brownfields funding. So brownfields are sites that have environmental contamination and they're being redeveloped for future use. And typically farming doesn't happen on brownfields properties, but it can. And if you do fall into that category, then there is funding, at least in Maine and many states across the country. The federal government has provided quite significant funding to states to fund things like environmental site assessments. So we were just getting funding for a nonprofit that has purchased farmland, and they were getting funding through this brownfields program. So that's something to consider if you're looking for funding on that. But I will caution you, two things. One is most farmlands would not be considered brownfields. And the other one is one of the prerequisites, at least in Maine, to getting that funding was being a nonprofit organization. So again, this goes back to what Laura was saying about what type of entity is owning the farm or operating at the farm. So that was so we have a couple minutes for questions. Scott, I know you've been organizing those.
Absolutely. I've been doing my best to keep track of everything and make sure that I have it a little bit organized here. So there's a quick follow-up to Rachel's question related to financial support for site assessment and testing, and it's from Susan. And she's asking specifically, are there any agencies we can contact to get the site assessments and testing prior to getting into a contract? And I know that, your expertise is mainly in Maine and New Hampshire. Susan's in Rhode Island, and I'm curious if you just, if you happen to know anything about what's going on there.
So I would say the information that I shared about brownfields funding would be relevant in any state. The funding would come most likely through the state's Department of Environmental Protection or equivalent in Rhode Island. Honestly, I would just look at that website and find out who at the department is managing the brownfields program. And find out whether or not that's something that you would qualify for depending on the property. Like I said, most farmland isn't going to qualify for that, but that is, that is something that that you can look at for that purpose. And then many areas and states do have funds to support farmers to purchase farmland or ensure that land remains viable for agricultural use. And for many different purposes. So I would look into grant opportunities there. And then the PFAS funding, that's a main thing, but more and more states are developing programs similar for farmers. And so again, that's typically either done through the agricultural department, which in Maine is different from it's the Department of Agricultural Conservation and Forestry. And sometimes that's through the Department of Environmental Protection. So I think those would be the places I would first call to find out from a state level if there's any funding available for that type of environmental assessment.
Great, thanks for that. And then we've got another question here. Could you discuss a bit more the process of contesting or applying for alternative zoning?
Yeah, so it depends on the state, it depends on the jurisdiction. I'll speak to New Hampshire just because that's where most of my zoning experience is. And I'm here in Maine, I do mostly sort of zoning adjacent work. But so in New Hampshire, if you want to deviate from what the zoning ordinance says, then you apply for a variance. And there's 5 factors, 5 criteria that you have to meet in order to obtain a variance. It's the zoning board that determines whether or not those 5 factors are met. Those 5 factors and then the case law that fleshes out what those 5 factors mean, that's set by common law and statutory law. So the statutes, the law that's on the books, and then the cases that are decided by the New Hampshire Supreme Court. There's also a special thing called, sorry, sort of redundant, but special exception under the zoning ordinance. And so what a special exception is unlike a variance where you want to do a thing that's just not at all listed in the sort of slate of permitted uses, a special exception is a thing that is specifically listed in that zone, but only with the permission of the zoning board. So it's sort of like, you get special permission to do whatever is permitted by the ordinance. That's what a special exception is. It's the same process for asking for a special exception by the zoning board. You file an application, the ZBA decides whether or not you get it. If you don't get it, you can appeal. And both the ordinance and the state law determines what the sort of criteria are that you need to meet in order to get that special exception. Planning boards don't issue variances or special exceptions, but they can do conditional use permits and other sort of forms of relief. It's like small deviations from what the specific requirements are in the zoning ordinance, but in New Hampshire, the real way to get around the zoning ordinance is to apply for that variance or the special exception.
Wonderful. I think we've got time for a couple more questions here. So another question from Corey is, how far out does a site plan review need to be? And the example is, if I have ideas for the next 10 years of my farm, but might have ideas beyond those 10 years, does that need to be in the site plan, or would I just submit another one down the road?
Yeah, so it depends on the situation, right? And the types of development that you're thinking about, the types of business enterprise that you're thinking about, how and to what degree the public comes onto your property. That's really what the planning board is concerned about, and what the property is going to look like in the future. And I generally, I think a good rule of thumb is that if you're not already applying for the money to do the project that you want to do on your property, then you shouldn't get a site plan approval for it. Or if you don't have at least a budget for how much it's going to cost, then you don't need site plan approval yet. Of course, go back to what the site plan regulations say, check with the planner. But plans change, and you don't want to be bound by something in the site plan, or sort of limit what you can do with your property without thinking through all of the ramifications of that. So, I think file a proposal for what you want to do in the immediate future, and then 10 years down the road, if you want to put up that farm to table restaurant, if you want to have an inn dedicated to farm workers and farm food and farm tourists, then file the application at that time.
I will add on to that. One thing is, once you own property, keep abreast of the zoning changes that might be happening. Again, this is something that I've been dealing with a couple farmers recently, where there's potentially impending zoning changes that may impact their property in the near future that are being discussed at, town planning meetings. So if you know that the use that you want to do might not be allowed under future zoning changes that might happen, then you may want to apply for it a little bit prematurely. That way you would be considered it would be an existing use, and you'd still be able to continue that. So just once you do move into a property, keep abreast of any potential zoning changes that may be happening, and that could shift your time frame, right, in terms of when you would apply for some of these approvals.
That is such a smart addition, Stacy. Really, really well said. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, go ahead, Laura.
Oh, no, I just was going to say thank you so much, Scott. Do you have more questions for us, or how would you like us to wrap up here?
Well, I think we've just about run out of time here, and I want to be respectful of your time. And so, I just want to thank both of you for taking the time to help us with this topic, and to thank everyone for joining. I just dropped a couple of links in the chat. So the first one is for legal assistance. If you need legal assistance to the Legal Food Hub, please feel free to apply at legalfoodhub.org. And then I also dropped the link for registering for the rest of the webinar series. And yeah, so thank you to all of you. We've recorded this webinar, and we will circulate a link for it at some point in the future. And I've also seen requests for the PowerPoint, and so I think we'll be able to circulate that too.
Yeah, we're
absolutely
absolutely happy to provide that. Go ahead. Just, I should have said, Scott, and sorry, this is like another annoying lawyer thing, but if you do, anybody in the audience, if you do want specific, case specific advice, please reach out to us. Here's our phone numbers and email addresses. And we have to say, we don't yet have an attorney-client relationship. None of the contents of this presentation is legal advice. But thanks for sitting through the disclaimer.
And thank you, Scott, and to Mary, who's unfortunately not able to be here today, for organizing this. This was great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to both of you, and thank you to all of our attendees. So wonderful. Looking forward to seeing a lot of you at the next webinar, which is going to be next Wednesday, so 1 week from today. Just head to that link that I dropped in the chat, and you'll be able to register. Okay.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye, everyone.